It's something that, I was taught a long time ago as a young seminarian that, the pulpit is something to be respected. And when you come up and preach and you use the pulpit for something else, like venting or things like that, that aren't appropriate, it's time to kind of step back. And I felt like I did a lot of that, over the years. I don't think it was horrible, but still, because I respect the pulpit so much, it was good to kind of get back and kind of control some of that angst before I come up and kind of talk about that. And I've seen pastors abuse the pulpit in that way, and God has shown me that. And he always asks me, so is that something you want to do? I was like, no, then why do you do it? So, once you kind of know that in your soul, and then yet you kind of continue to do that kind of stuff, you got to kind of step back and kind of see. So it was good to do that. But at the same time, I realized that, you can't always step back from things at the same time too, because it's not everything's going to be solved, and sometimes you got to go about doing the things that you need to do at the same time, dealing with the problems at the same time. So I kind of learned that too. Because I can't go to my wife and go, I need a break from, our family, because, it's kind of, I can't always do that, but it was good to kind of to step back a little bit and kind of do that. But, I learned a lot of lessons from that as well. So it was good to be back. It was weird because I haven't done this in so long that I came and I was getting ready for praise. And I was like, something's missing, something's wrong. And I realized I forgot to put on my microphone. And I would have come up here without a mic, so I'm not really used to that. But here I am, and while I was preparing for this sermon, I was like, man, I should have taken another month off and came back when we're doing Romans instead of doing this sermon, because the topic is Life is Beautiful. And Sam's, in the first year, he was in charge of kind of coming up with topics for our services and things like that, and that's his job as one of the many pastors in our plurality of elders model that we hold dear here at our church, and he's in charge of kind of doing that. So I like to know ahead of time what I'm preaching about. So I look at the topics, and I got like gospel. I was like, yeah, that's mine. I love it. And then I got Life is Beautiful. I was like, why is he doing that? I was like, he made a mistake or something like that. So while I was getting closer, I asked him, what? I think I even texted, what do you mean by Life is Beautiful? And he said all this kind of stuff. He said, like the movie. I was like, I was already thinking that. And then he said some of the other stuff. He said, just Life is Beautiful in general. And I asked him later, I was like, why'd you have me do Life is Beautiful? He's like, because you don't think life is beautiful. Okay. I don't understand the logic in that. But I do, kind of, because sometimes we need to work on certain things that we don't do really well or we're not good at. And it's a humiliating exercise and those types of things. And this is one of them. And, we always say you got to practice what you preach and that kind of stuff, and we like people who are consistent with who they are and what they talk about. But, as I talk about Life is Beautiful, and even though I have trouble believing that, I don't like to think that I'm being hypocritical in that, because what it is this exercise for me was helping to understand what that really means. So I'm learning along with you guys, right? And I should technically be sitting with you as we talk about this, but I can't preach from down there, so I got to come up here and do this. So this is not talking at you, I'm learning with you, and in terms of that, and I hope that really comes through. But it's one of the things I struggle with the most. Life is beautiful, because I don't always think that for several reasons. But one of the things that that really troubles me when it comes to Life is Beautiful is the inconsistencies of life. Now you got to understand, I'm a consummate idealist. Okay, I like things a certain way. I don't like inconsistencies. I don't like surprises except for money that I find in my pocket when I do laundry. That's awesome. But other types of inconsistencies and things like that, it really bothers me, okay? And things that are off schedule. So, for example, you see this kind of stuff all the time. We kind of take this stuff for granted because we see it all the time, and we don't always think deeply about them. But you see it when you watch the news, right? So you'll see this. So they'll start out in news anchors, and all the people will be on TV, and they'll say things like, in breaking news, and they have these solemn faces, the Russians shot down a Malaysian jetliner. Everybody's like, oh, they're being all serious. And 2 seconds later, but the summer's around the corner, and barbecues are back. And then they go from this tragedy to barbecues, right? And the barbecues and everybody smiles, and then forget the airliner and 200-something people that just got shot down and killed. You went to something that was more beautiful, or so they think. And then you go to now the weather, and you see this blonde lady with really tight clothing and stuff like that, calling herself a meteorologist, pointing to a bunch of numbers and things like that, as if she knows what she's really talking about. And I was like, wow, I went from tragedy to barbecues to, wow, how do I get that job, right? How do I do that? And the inconsistencies like that sometimes kind of bothers me. I see that on TV in terms of shows. Like, how many guys watch the show Suits on USA Network? Woo, all right, 2. The other service only had 1. Okay, so this service is much better. But in that show, you watch it every single week. It's about lawyers, and now it's about investment bankers too. But it's always about finding leverage against other people in order to get things or to trap them into doing something. You see that over and over and over again, and they do that kind of stuff, and then they have these moments of tenderness, right? Where people kind of connect a little bit, and they go, we're not trying to be so cold, and it's always the women telling the men to be like that, because the women are never cold in suits, right? It's kind of a weird show like that. And I was like, it's so inconsistent where you can go to a courtroom and talk to each other in that way, stab each other in the back, hey, let's go out for coffee and have tender moments with one another, and think that's okay, right? But our lawyers are like that. They hate each other in the courtroom, and afterwards, let's go play golf, And that's so inconsistent to me, to the point where it becomes almost meaningless, right? Yet they have some type of moral code, but it's embedded in backstabbing and finding leverage against another. Yeah. I also see this in the movie Parenthood. I know there's a show called Parenthood for all the young people out there. I'm hesitant to use this around here because you guys are so much younger than I am. But there's this movie called Parenthood a long time ago. Guy's name is Steve Martin. Do you guys know who Steve Martin is? Oh, you do? Oh, cool. That's more than first service. Wow. That's kind of interesting. And then there's this tender moment within the movie. And it's all silly, and they try to get all serious. You know that, right? You see, and then there's this moment where the husband and wife are having marital problems, and they're fighting, and Grandma's there. And Grandma's a really interesting person, and she just, out of the middle of this conversation, she says this. When I was 19, Grandma took me on a roller coaster, or Grandpa took me on a roller coaster. So in this middle of this crazy conversation and this yelling, she says this. The husband, the sarcastic, goes, oh? And she says, up, down, oh, what a ride. And he says sarcastically, oh, what a great story. And then she says, I always wanted to go again. It was just so interesting to me that a ride could make me so frightened, so scared, so sick, so excited, and so thrilled all together. Some didn't like it. They went on the merry-go-round. That just goes around. Nothing. I like the roller coaster. You get more out of it. What she's saying is what we've been kind of talking about. How can one ride make you so scared and joyful and so happy and so fearful all at the same time? And such is life. And she accepts it the way that it is, and she finds meaning in that. Life is meaningful because there's these ups and downs that you just kind of take it, right? There's this song, and in this song is a line, and I have it on my phone actually, even though I don't really believe it. But the line in the song says this: color my life with the chaos of trouble. Sounds cool, huh? It's like you go to a fortune cookie and you color my life with the chaos of trouble. And what that is when trouble comes into your life and these inconsistencies come into your life, it makes your life more colorful. It makes your life more enjoyable, so just accept it for what it is. And that's what the world teaches us, right? Even though deep down in our heart we know that these things are so inconsistent. But what other choice do we have besides just accepting it? But I think there are choices. Now, at this point, you can do a few things. You can look at the world and accept it for what it is, and we hear that all the time, accept it. We hear it in Frozen, let it go, right? I hate that song. Or you can look at the world differently from an outside perspective, right? And we know the power of an outside perspective. Why? Because we're always good at criticizing other people's problems, and we're always good at seeing clearly what other people do because we're on the outside looking in. But at the same time, we can reverse it, and we understand that sometimes when we're trying to make decisions and we have issues in our lives, we like to look at other people that are outside of our sphere that we're living in and have them look at us in a more impartial manner. And we understand that different perspectives of others helps us to see things a little bit more clearly, right? And that's embedded within us as human beings. But for those of you who just say, you know what, there's inconsistencies in life, I like watching the news and seeing the tragedy, barbecue, and the blonde in tight clothes, and you just say, accept it for what it is. That's what life is, right? The French say, c'est la vie, right? Es la vida. Or we just say, that's life. Or stuff happens, right? And we just say that. Love second service, right? But for those of you who just say, accept it as it is, I know what you're saying. Can't change it, so fine, right? Can't change it, so fine. But I would say to you that it's a wise thing that you're saying. Accept it. But if it just stays at that level, I would argue that you're not being true to who you are. You're missing out on life. You're missing out on the beauty of life. You're denying what your soul is actually craving. You will live a life full of contradiction, of inconsistencies, because you have become a slave to your environment that is just as contradictory and inconsistent as what your soul is, right? And the identity that your soul says it is. It's completely in violation of what your soul truly wants. And what it wants is something that transcends this world. There's got to be something more than this. Namely something that is more, something that is eternal, something that is beautiful, right? And we like to see the beauty in things. I see it and I hear it in conversations all the time where people try to transcend, right, the inconsistencies, the senselessness of our world by trying to find some type of moral center or trying to transcend that on their own. I hear it all the time. I hear it when people admire other people who can see the good in people, right? Because they don't want to stay with that particular perspective of that person. There has to be more than that. There has to be something better. But a contradictory, inconsistent view of life without transcendence leads to denial of who you really are. But a contradictory, inconsistent view of life seen through the lens of an outside perspective leads to beauty and a realization of a life full of beauty that is lived with a clear understanding of your true identity and who you are. Your life and your soul are one as your soul thirsts for something transcendent, something eternal. See, as a Sprite commercial says, we need to learn to obey our thirst. We have a thirst for something that's... You're not supposed to laugh at that. You're supposed to be serious. Right? But obey your thirst. Your thirst tells you something about who you are. And the beauty comes from understanding who you are, accepting it, and accepting that you can't find meaning here in this world. So in the text that we're about to look at today, we're going to see the observations of a man, one of the wisest men of all time, maybe, of all the Bible anyway. And, we have so many different stories of his wisdom. And he sees the contradictions and inconsistencies of life and concludes that everything under the sun is meaningless. He couldn't find meaning in this world. And this is a man that had it all. He had the riches, he had the wisdom, he had hundreds of concubines and hundreds of wives. That was the unwise thing that he did. And concludes that everything under the sun is meaningless. Everything in creation, everything in this world is just meaningless. And when I think of something to do with beauty and beauty in the Bible, this is a definitive passage that explains the beauty that can be found in something that is so inconsistent, contradictory, and meaningless. So we're going to go to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, 1 through 14. Now the theme of the book of Ecclesiastes is found in the first verse of the book, chapter 1, verse 1, where he basically says this: everything under the sun is meaningless. Everything is meaningless. The words of the teacher, son of David, you think that's Solomon, king of Jerusalem, meaningless, meaningless, says a teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. He says that over and over again as you read Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes to me was one of the most frustrating Bible books I had to read, but at the same time I see myself in this to some extent because he sees all these inconsistencies. This guy is the wisest man. He says, but wisdom is folly. Why? Because what happens to the wise man compared to a fool? The wise man eventually does what? He dies. So does a fool. So what's really the difference? But at the same time, another part of the book, he says, but if you're going to live life, better to be wise than be a fool. But if you get cocky, don't get cocky, because what happens to the wise? They end up dead, just like the foolish people do. And I was like, this is crazy. This is way too inconsistent. And then he says, it's meaningless, and there's nothing new under the sun, and everything is meaningless, over and over and over again. This guy is so negative. Just like, I love this. It's just like me. And I was like, wow. But he concludes that there's something greater than that, right? And that's the beauty of this book. So I'm going to pick it up in chapter 3, right? And he says this. And he's talking about the inconsistencies that we see in the world and the contradictions. There is a time for everything. This is also a song, by the way, by the Birds. Okay. There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. What he's saying, there's a time and an appropriate thing for everything. That there's a method to the madness that we see in the world. That something is in control of all these things. And what are some of these things that we see? Verse 2, a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill, which is also a movie with Sandra Bullock. And a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. It's these opposite things that pull us all the time in life that we just put together, but at the same time it seems so senseless and meaningless, right? You know, yesterday, Timmy, as we like to call him, it was his first birthday, and that's a big deal, right? I just call it dole, like the pineapple, because I don't know how to say it right. So we had his dole yesterday, and no pineapples, but just a dole. And it was kind of a bittersweet moment for me. It's like these contradicting things that, pull at me, because my father came, and I found out this past week my father has cancer. Okay, so he has things on his mind, obviously, and things on my mind. And we found this out this past week. At the same time, we were preparing for a birthday, a dole, right, that celebrates the first year of a new life. So I was like, man, I just heard this bad news about my father, but at the same time, there's a celebratory nature of what we're doing this week. And I saw my father come in, and, sometimes he had this kind of sheepish smile on his face, but he didn't smile this time when he walked in. And I kind of knew, and he saw me holding Timothy. And he kind of smiled a little bit because, babies. And Timothy smiles much more than I do. It's kind of sad when you're jealous of your 1-year-old. He smiles more than you do. But I saw my father he held him a little bit, and then he kind of gave him back to my father-in-law. And I was thinking, he may be thinking that he may not live to see this son grow up, my son grow up. And it was a very contradictory thing, right? And when we keep it there, it seems senseless, doesn't it? When someone just died, or someone gets hit by a drunk driver or something like that in life, we think it's so senseless. There's no meaning behind all this. And then when I was talking to my stepmother, and she was saying, your father stopped exercising. I was like, why did he stop exercising? He's been telling me to exercise. He always tells me how fat I am every time I see him. And he said, well, he was thinking, why should he exercise? He might not live soon, so what's the point? So when people have this loss of hope and loss of something that is greater than the world around us, things become very meaningless, right? I saw that in my own mother, and my mother was a very interesting woman. And I didn't know how interesting she was until her funeral, when one of the pastors came and talked to me, and there was all this stuff written on the little bulletin. And my mom had gone to college, and I go, what's the big deal? All Koreans go to college. In fact, we're mandated to go to college. He said, no, you don't understand. Back in those days, women didn't go to school. Okay? And your mom went to school. That's a very small portion of the population. And your mom also majored in chemistry. Okay? So in a time where a lot of women didn't go to college, women certainly didn't major in chemistry. Okay? So your mom was a very fantastic person, right? A very unique person, and she was. But at the same time, seeing my mom growing up, she was always searching for something. She had to work hard for something. Something was pulling her and pushing her all at the same time, right? Something that was greater, something that was bigger than her, but she didn't find it in the scripture. She tried to find it in the world. But towards the end of her life, I remember taking her to the doctor because her foot had swelled up like crazy. And after I had taken her home, she handed me a $100 bill. I said, why are you giving me this? I'm your son. I took you to the doctor. You don't have to pay me. She's all, this is just a worthless piece of paper to me. So you have more use for it than I do. And it was surprising for me to say that because my mom would never, ever say something like that. When I was young, I confronted her one time. I was like, why do you care so much about money? She said, money is very important. I don't think it's that important because you don't know anything. And I didn't, right? I didn't. But for her to get to a point to say, this is worthless. And she said, I worked hard for what? All this suffering that I went to, all this stress to work hard every day, what was it all for? When there's no hope, things become very meaningless, right? And she realized that. And then towards the end, she's like, man, but I'm reading the Bible a lot more. She's like, man, it is fun. She was talking about it like she was reading Harry Potter or something like that. She was like, it's so good. Because when all this other stuff had fallen aside, right? The things that she put so much of her life into and so much of her identity into, and when those things started to become meaningless, what was very meaningful became something that she could see a lot more clearly than she had before. And she had this glow in her eye, even though she was sick, and said, man, the Bible, it's interesting, it's fun. And I almost said, well, duh. But you don't say that to a person who's sick, right? You just don't. I was like, it took you this long to realize that. And I think she had a lot of regrets. I worked so hard for what? Right? See, people are wired for hope. And I want you to see that in the next couple of verses. We are wired for something bigger. We're wired for something greater. It's watching Three Musketeers, but there's actually four of them. And they hang out and they say things. We want to serve something or someone greater than ourselves. Right? And it's those speeches that they make, right? And the music starts to come up in the movie. And I was like, dang, where's my sword? And I want to do it, but I only have a chopstick. So, I want to do something. Because in us, within you, there's something built into you that desires something greater, to serve something greater or someone greater, to see past the meaninglessness of this world. We're designed for that. And how do I know that? Because it says in verse 9, what do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. You and I told believing that, but it says he has made everything beautiful in his time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there's nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever, because he is eternal. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. And what this passage is again saying is that God makes beautiful things beautiful in its time, in the midst of something that's meaningless. But at the same time, God has placed eternity within our hearts, right? So that we have this kind of restlessness that there's something in this world that just cannot fulfill us. At that point, once again, you can accept it for what it is and stay there and deny who you are, that you are a person that desires something more, that desires something eternal. Or you can come to a realization of, that's who I am, and I want to desire more. And how do you do that? Because think about it. If there's nothing meaningful in this world, right? And we don't think that is right now because we're at a stage where we find meaning in a lot of things that we do, maybe, right? But then nothing really satisfied me. But at the same time, my soul desires for something better. So if there's nothing new under the sun that can satisfy me and everything is meaningless, then I must look above the sun in order to find something meaningful for me. And I think that's what Solomon is trying to get us to realize. That's what we're created to do. And there's something beautiful in that when we can rise above our circumstances, right? And that's taught throughout Scripture because as soon as I read this, I think of Jesus, right? In John chapter 4, Jesus goes to the woman at this well, a woman who was involved in some interesting life choices. He says, give me a drink of water. And she says, well, I can't get that water. He says, well, I have this water that I can give to you where you will never thirst again. And why is Jesus saying that? Because he knows that she has a desire for the eternal. And he knows he is the fulfillment of that desire because he is eternal life, right? And he's the only one that can fulfill her. So when you read that in the context of something like this in the Old Testament, you go, man, this is huge. This is awesome. That Jesus knows that. Why? Because he was there at creation, right? And he knows that eternity has been placed, and the desire for the eternal has been placed in the hearts of men, and we desire that. But again, Solomon is helping us understand that when you know that, things become a lot better. Right? I think we're already in tune with that too. Because how many times have you heard people say stuff like this? Why do you do the things that you do? That's who I am. And Hamlet, it says, this above all to thine own self be true. Be true to yourself. We hear that all the time, right? Usually in Disney cartoons. Be true to yourself. Right? We know that. Why do you do the things that you do? That's just my personality. God has placed that within us because God is consistent with who he is and what he does. And he knows that, right? But there's a kind of beauty to that. And it's going to help us to understand that I am created for more, right? And created for the eternal. I was talking to one of our congregation members. And I said his name per service, so I'll say it. His name is Danny Reed. Do you know Danny Reed? Interesting guy. I call him Dynamite. Little small guy, a lot of power, Dynamite. And I was at his house, and then we were just kind of talking. And, he was doing the obligatory barbecue for everybody, so I can't just sit in there with the ladies. I had to go out, too. So I was like, all right. So I got there. And talking to him. And I asked him, I was like, Danny, he said, how's your work? He's all, I love it, And he always has to talk at a certain angle, and his head has to go up and down with what he's saying. I love it. And then he's, flipping his thing, and he points his little spatula at me. And I was like, Josh, you don't point your spatula at someone older. Where's my spatula, And then he said, I love my job because I'm good at it. And usually when someone says, I love my job and I'm good at it, I was like, you little narcissistic, arrogant little kotachi head, you booger snot. I was like, what? But I didn't think that at all when he said that. Why? Because he was just saying, this is who I am, and this is what I do. I'm good at what I do. And he said, I've grown from this. I know how to manage people a lot better. When I was younger, I kind of didn't know, but now I know, and I know a lot better. That's good. And he started, philosophizing. I don't even know if that's a word, but he does it, right? And Danny Reed, he's a preacher that doesn't preach the Bible, but preaches everything else, right? So he's preaching about the world. Well, I'm sure he preaches the Bible, too. But he was preaching about the world, and he was saying stuff like, too much money, no good. Too little money, no good. Just the amount of money, good. And then he stopped talking, and he went back to barbecuing. Because people who are profound only say short phrases, and they stop. Right? So that's what they do. And I was really envious of my conversation with this guy. I was not envious of his height, but I was, second service, But I was envious of him. Why? Because he's found something that's consistent with who he is. I'm good at what I do. And Danny, he can sell. He can sell sand to people who live in the desert, and they'll buy it. He knows how to sell. He knows how to talk to people. Why? I do what I do because this is who I am. Consistent, right? There's a beauty to that. People have left jobs because this is just not who I am. Even though the paycheck is nice, it's just not who I am. It's not consistent with who I am. So I need to go out and find that. Because God has placed that, right? And I struggle with that. I struggle with that so much. I struggle with that a lot, even at yesterday's dole. Because I was talking to my cousin. My cousin was there. Her name is Sandy. And we were not close. I didn't know who my cousins were until my mom passed away. And I met one of them at the funeral. And Sandy is really cool. She goes to Mosaic Church, actually. And I was like, wow, that's cool, man. I've been there several times. And we were talking, and I was like, what's our family like? And, she's like, my father, he's the oldest of 7 children, 6 boys and 1 girl. See, if I had a bunch of kids, I would have to do the same thing, because for some reason I only get boys when we have kids, right? So we had 6 boys and 1 girl, and she was just rattling them all off. And Sandy, she went to Cornell, she went to Stanford, she's a doctor. Her husband went to Stanford, and he's a doctor. And then so-and-so, they went to Cornell, and they're doctors, and the doctors married psychiatrists. And I was like, dang. And there's the other one, they went to this side, they went to Duke, and they're doctors, and they went to this and that. So what do you do? I go to doctors, and things like that. And I was like, my gosh, my whole side of my dad's family, they're a bunch of Ivy League going, overachieving physicians, And I was like, you try to teach special ed kids. You can't do that. That's what I do, right? And I was like, man, I'm like the black sheep of my family. And thoughts like that kind of come into your head. I was like, and my brother's a doctor. So they can go to conventions and doctors, and they'll be talking about medical stuff, and I'll go, hey, there's these special ed kids, and that's the only way I can have conversations with them. I was like, that kind of sucks. But I was like, I've always struggled to find something that I'm good at and is appropriate for who I am, so I can say, I'm good at this, and be able to have that confidence in that, right? But I don't think pastoring is it, because I have this love-hate relationship with pastor. Every chance I get to not pastor, I try to take it, and I've been doing that for 15 years, right? So recently, I was like, an opportunity came up, and I was like, I'm going to, apply to be a speech therapist, right? which one of our pastors thinks it's about helping people make speeches. But it's not. It's not what that is at all. Now you know who it is. And you know, no, you pronounced that wrong. It's jerk. There you go. All right. But I was like, this is it. This is awesome. And people, like other people that were special teachers, were encouraging me to do this. It's a good thing for you. You know, my counselor saying, that's a good thing for you. I was like, this is signs from God. You know, telling me I should do this. Because, you know, we do that. You know, we say stuff like, if the sun comes out tomorrow, it's a sign that I should do this. Sun comes out tomorrow, I should do this, you know, and things like that. So I was like, that's what it must be. And I emailed the pastor, and I said, you know, I might have to quit pastoring because this is not an easy thing to do. You know, it was, you know, there's a lot of people that apply to these programs. They don't always get in, and you have to do a lot of stuff. And they basically tell you have no life as you go through this program. So I was like, this is it. This is my opportunity to get out. You know, I'll still serve. I can be normal. I was like, man, Sarah, it'd be awesome to go to church and just be normal and be a part of the congregation, have friends, and you can drink beer with them and not feel bad and all that kind of stuff. I was like, this is my opportunity. This is it. So I told her, I asked her, you know, just pray for me, all that kind of stuff. But I pretty much said, I'm dropping this. We're done. I told Sarah, no more pastoring. No reaction. She's like, yeah. So we go to Atlanta, right? So we're going to go to Atlanta, you know, awesome place to be with my in-laws, you know, awesome. And on my list of things to do was to visit North Point Church, a huge church. And we were going there. We're just amazed by it. I was like, man, we're getting into this thing, you know, really well. And there's cops outside that are directing us in. And they go, turn on your flashers if you have kids. We turn on the flashers, and people go like this. And they direct us into this other parking lot. I was like, man, these white people, they know how to do church, man. So Sam always has this phrase like, you know, white people good. We need to be a church that's white people good. And I was like, okay, so I suck because I'm not white. But they do it really well. And as we're going to a service, I'm looking around, I'm taking pictures, and I'm sending them to our pastoral staff. Right? I don't want, even though I decided I'm not going to be a pastor anymore. I'm not going to do this. So the service starts, and I was like, man, this is awesome. So one of the pastors comes out, the campus pastor, and he does announcements, and he says certain things. I was like, dude, this guy just preached the gospel twice. I was like, whoa. And then they did this little short video, something like that. I was like, wow, that totally ties in with the theme of what they're talking about because the pastor just introduced a theme. I was like, awesome. And then they did this baptism on this balcony, and it was like all tear-jerking, and you can hear the in the audience, but it was in Dolby surround sound because there's 700 of us in there. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. Everything just runs together. Man, I want to get baptized again. I want to go in there and do that. And then the pastor comes out and he starts talking about stuff, and he's like, you know, the non-Christians in the audience. And I was like, man, he addressed non-Christians 5 times during his sermon because I counted, right? Because, you know, it's sucky how there might be non-Christians in the church, and you talk about them as if they're not there. He doesn't do that. He includes them. I was like, wow, he does that. And I was like, man, I'm not going to be a pastor, but at the same time, what am I doing? I'm being a pastor. You know, and I'm looking for these things. And I was like, man, this is beautiful. And I was like, Sarah, this is awesome. Man, we don't have to go on the trip with your in-laws anymore. We can go home now because this is awesome. And this is great. And she said, no, we can't do that. I was like, dang, did you not feel God? You know, he's telling us something. Go home. 집에 가. You know? But it was so weird. And you know, Sarah was excited. We're talking. I was like, yeah, we're so awesome. You know, we could move. We would go to this church if we lived here. Yeah. And I was like, let's move here. And she said, no, we're not doing that. And I was like, okay. And then that night I went to visit one of my old friends. She's a youth pastor that was instrumental in me becoming a pastor. She's the one that encouraged me to do that. She recognized my gifts, and she really encouraged me to do that. And I hadn't seen her for a long time. It's been over 10 years. And I had carried her baby, her first son, Christian. You know, that's a very original name. And I carried Christian around. I really loved her son because I loved, you know, her. She's like my sister. And now he's going to college, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I am old. So I'm sitting in this room, and she's like in her 50s now. Don't tell her. I said that because, you know, we're all stuck in the 20s, you know, when you get to a certain age. And she was just talking about her ministry, and she's still doing youth ministry in her 50s. I was like, can you still connect with the kids? Oh, yeah. And I believe she can. And she's still doing the ministry. And while she was talking, and she was saying how, you know, I still go after those kids that are kind of on the fringe, the kids on the outside that no one wants to really talk to, the troubled kids that don't have parents that are really involved in their lives. And I still do that. And I just kind of smiled. I was like, you're up to your old tricks. And don't you dare ever change that. because I was like, I'm one of those people that she reached out to, right? And what a beautiful moment. And I went home that night, and I wrote this email, and I was like, great to see you again. And I felt so old. She has 3 sons now. And then she said, are you going to have another one? I was like, no, because I'm going to have another son too. I was like, I don't want three sons. And, and I encouraged, and I said, I became a pastor because of you. Yeah, because of God too, but because of you too. You were instrumental in encouraging me to be a pastor. You encouraged me, even though I was a really angry, bitter, kid who just was mad at the world. And I was like, I haven't changed a bit since then, But that's who I was, and you reached out to me. I became a pastor, and God has used me to bless people. Whether I acknowledge that or not, He has. And I was like, you were instrumental in doing that because you reached out to someone that was on the fridge, that was on the outside. And I bet there's a bunch of people in your ministry. Who knows how many other pastors and missionaries will come out of your ministry because of what you did. And she emailed me back, and she said, I wouldn't make an old lady cry. I was like, yes. I will tattoo a teardrop on my chest or something like that. And she said, I've been struggling. So I just came out of a ministry situation where it was very difficult. She said it hurt me and to the core of my being. That surprised me because she's a tough cookie. She's a tough lady. You say something to her, she'll say something. She won't necessarily say it, but she's really good at what she does, and she'll stick up for herself. She's very tough. So for her to say that she was shaken to the core of her being was tough, because she had been hurt. She's like, you think that you know people after 30 years of doing ministry, but you don't. And she had been hurt that much, and she said she spent many nights crying, and crying, and just praying, and just being upset. How can this happen to me? Where we were talking about full-time ministry during the course of the dinner, and her husband flat out said, don't do it. And I was like, something is up. I knew something was up, and I knew what it was when she emailed me back. But she said, a lot of times I doubted my calling because of things that I happened, but after, your email to me, you're one of those people that God used to really encourage me. I was like, that's awesome. For pastors, doing ministry is something that's very personal to us. People always go, why take things personally? Because pastoring is personal to us. It's not like any other job. It's not like working at McDonald's. The benefits are better at McDonald's. Right? It's not the same thing. It's very personal. Right? What we do is very personal. You can't separate who you are from pastoring. You preach out of who you are, you teach out of who you are, you minister out of who you are. And you can try to fool people, but people aren't fooled. Okay? People have very good BS detectors when it comes to people and pastoring. It's very personal to us, and it's a big deal. So I knew it was a big deal for her. And I'm glad I was able to encourage her to do something like that. But it's also, pastoring isn't one of those jobs where I can say, man, I make 6 figures. So even though I don't like my job, my family's fed and all that kind of stuff, pastoring is one of those jobs that you have to have another job in order to feed your family and all that kind of stuff. So there's nothing like that there. It's a very personal thing. So I knew it was a big deal for her. And some of this stuff is very personal to me because God uses a lot of these senseless things. So when we have ministry struggles, a lot of people in the congregation don't understand, why is the pastor so angry and so hurt by some of the things that happen? Why? Because it's so personal to us. It's different. It's a perspective that many people don't have. And that's why I'll say, Sarah, let's just be a congregation member. Because it's so much better than sometimes being a pastor. Because that personal nature isn't always there. And we can get so hurt by that. But in the midst of something so senseless, something beautiful came out of that because we were willing to accept, or she was willing to accept, that stuff happens in churches. But she was able to see something that transcended that. Something that's more eternal, something that's more meaningful, something that's more beautiful. And that's what she was sharing with me through that email. And that was like 2 o'clock in the morning. Because I was sleeping on the ground and Noah was on the bed and he rolled off the bed on top of me and he woke me up. And then he rolled off of me and just went, and I was like, wow, I'm going to go check my email, and there it was. And what a beautiful moment in the midst of something so senseless as my son rolling on top of me. But that wasn't the only thing. And while I was preparing for this sermon, one of the hardest sermons I've ever had to prepare for, because I have a really hard time understanding that life is beautiful, right? It's very difficult. And I really had to reflect on my life, and there has been moments of beauty that God has shown me, but I've just forgotten. And one of those moments was, when I was youth pastoring, I was in the sanctuary. It was a main sanctuary where we had the youth and EM together, and we did like a joint service every once in a while. And I was having one of those angst-filled days. I was going to just preach my heart out and talk about hurt and all this other stuff and all that. And I went up there and I did that. I was like going off, and I was like, man, I was on fire. Call 911. I'm going. And then one of the youth group parents walked in and sat down, and she stared right at me. I was like, oh, snot. I need to talk about like grace and love and forgiveness and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, no, I'm going for it. Go do it. And I'm just chugging forward, and I was just, just preaching my heart out, like, I have a dream, that kind of stuff. And at the end of the service, I saw her get up, and she was staring at me the whole time like a security camera. She got up, and she went to one of the youth group teachers. Because parents never come directly to me because I don't speak Korean. Sometimes, which is really good in a Korean church, sometimes it's not. So she went to go talk to this other teacher who was like my older sister. And she really took care of me too. And I saw them talking, and their faces were very solemn. That's not a good sign, right? So I was kind of moseying on over there, pretending to pick up trash off the ground in the sanctuary to kind of listen in on the conversation. But there was no trash to be found. So I started kind of walking away, and I was just kind of waiting around, and I saw the conversation end. The mother got up and walked out. And then she looked at me, and she motioned to me like this. Now, if you're married or have girlfriends, when your girlfriends do this or something like that, it's never a good sign. Okay? This never means, hey, let's go have some fun. It never means that. It means you are in trouble. Get over here. So I went over there, said, sit down. I was like, uh-oh. Sit down usually means I'm going to fall after what she tells me. So I sat down, and I'm talking to her. She said, so-and-so's mom was listening to your sermon. I was like, well, no, duh, because I saw her staring at me the whole time. She said, I already know what she's going to talk about. She didn't like what I was talking about. So I said, just be quiet. You always think you know everything. I was okay, fine. Okay. She said, so she listened to your sermon. I was okay. And she said, I can tell that Steve has been really hurt by life and hurt by church and hurt by ministry. And I was like, sympathy. Yes, God is good. That's awesome. And then I go, no, that's not the only thing. And she also said this. She said, but at the same time, how can a pastor understand the pain, the hurt, and suffering of his people unless he's gone through pain, suffering, and hurt himself? And she just looked at me and said, uh-huh. I was like, okay, fine. Okay, I get it. And I was like, wow, in the midst of all these struggles that I had, which to me was so senseless, and I can't find meaning in them. And I got to find meaning in what I do. I got to find meaning in my immediate surroundings, or I just can't move on. Right? If pastoring becomes so meaningless to me, I would stop right away, because I thrive for meaning. I thirst for meaning, right? But in the midst of so much senselessness and meaninglessness I found, God showed me something beautiful, that people expect sometimes a pastor to understand them when they've gone through suffering themselves. I was like, that's a beautiful moment. That really is. It's not something I could have manufactured. It's not something that I could have made up. It has to transcend the senselessness and the meaninglessness and the inconsistencies and the contradictions of life to find meaning from something above. Right? I heard that this past week. I was talking to some of our pastors, and I like our conversations with our pastors. And one of our pastors was talking about how they had lost a baby. And being a father, Sarah and I were talking about it last night too. We were kind of reminiscing about being parents, like as if we've done it for so long. And we're talking about how our children are so precious to us, and I could not imagine losing a child. I just can't. I'm one of those parents. I check up on my children every once in a while just to make sure they're breathing. So I'll go into Timothy's crib and I'll open the door a little bit, and I'll sneak in and I'll watch him. I was like, is he moving? And I'll poke him a little bit, and he goes, yeah. I was like, oh yes, and then I go to sleep. I can't sleep unless I do that, because what if there's SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, And Sarah always goes, don't worry about it, they're going to be okay. I was like, how do you know? When they stop breathing, you're going to say something else, so I'm going to go check, and you're going to thank me because I saved our children, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm one of those people. I'm hyper vigilant about my kids. I really am. Too much. And the one time that I wasn't hyper vigilant, I said, dude, you need to back off, trust God. And Noah ran away from me, and I had Timmy too. I was like, he's going to be okay. He ran out into the parking lot, trying to find their car, and another parent had to come and bring them in. So I was like, when you loosen up a little bit and go, I'm not going to be hypervigilant anymore, and then something bad does happen, what happens? You become doubly hypervigilant, right? So next time I'm going to bring a leash, I'm going to bring a GPS tracking device, I'm going to bring a tranquilizer gun so I can just shoot them from afar and knock them down. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm protecting my children, so I can't even fathom what it's like to lose a child. But when our pastors talk about how they did, but at the same time, something so senseless, they found meaning in that, because he said, because if that hadn't happened, then we wouldn't have adopted this other child. I was like, wow. You went from something that's senseless to something that was meaningful, because, yeah, this seems like something that's very senseless to me, but you went above that and transcended that. You know, I love it when I hear parents who sometimes are unable to have children. And I met a few. It was one of the other churches that we were at. And it's hard, because when you have couples and churches who can't have parents, there's 2 days that I heard that they don't like and they have really trouble with. It's Mother's Day and Father's Day, right? You don't show up for those days. It's hard. But, you know, there's people out there who are willing to accept that it's, man, why has this happened to me? It seems so senseless, but they find beauty in that too. And they go, you know, we're going to adopt a child and we're going to love them like their own. In fact, they are ours. They are our own. And I think that's amazing. And the whole adoption thing, I talk about it so much, and I talk about it a lot more now because I'm more comfortable talking about it than I ever have been. It's something that's very near and dear to my heart, right? Well, you don't know how many times I hear women say stuff like this, and I don't mean to be offensive, but at the same time, it's so meaningless to me. Like, you know, I don't, especially when they already have children, is I could never love a child, adopt a child, as much as I love my own child, because this child didn't come from me. And people always go, yeah, I understand that. I was like, how can you say that? Because you're not a woman. Oh, that's not fair. That's not my fault. You know? Although my wife says I act like a woman, but it's not the same thing, right? Not quite the same thing. Yeah, and I always get upset when I hear that, because I was like, as a Christian woman, how can you really say that? We sinned against God. We were enemies of God. We deserved hell. And yet God comes and he swoops in and he says, I am your father, I will your father, I'm going to adopt you as my children? Even though we were so offensive to him, and then you're going to turn around and say something like that. I was like, how do you even say that? So knowing that, and I've heard so many conversations like that, when I hear other conversations of people saying, you know what, these are difficult circumstances, and it's hard to find meaning in them, but I can transcend that and go, you know what, we're going to adopt and we're going to love this child just like it's ours, and in fact it is ours. There's beauty in that. See, when we know who we are and that, you know, that's what we really long for. That's where we find the meaning. When you try to put the pieces of the puzzle together without God, the only meaning that you'll find is the act of trying to find meaning. And you'll never find it. It's the people who keep dating and never find a relationship, because it's the process of finding a relationship that becomes meaningful and fulfilling, but at the same time, it doesn't fulfill you. It's like Chinese food. It just doesn't do it. Doesn't do it. I ate all the Chinese food. I'm still full. I still want to eat more. We had Chinese food yesterday on the way home. So I was like, what are we going to eat? I was like, we just ate food. It was Chinese food. Right? It's listening to parents and mothers who raise kids their entire life. And when their children have gotten old and gone to college, they're like, I don't know what to do anymore. Because the only meaning that they had was raising children, and that's it. And when the children are gone, don't have to raise them anymore, can't find meaning anymore. But that should tell us that we need to find something deeper. We need to find something greater. And that's where the beauty lies. Why is life beautiful? I think the scriptures teach us, and this passage teaches me, because God makes things beautiful in his time. The same God that placed eternity in your hearts, that you would naturally seek him, even though you don't always acknowledge it. In Solomon's observations about life, he found that being true to your desire for the eternal, at the same time acknowledging that, yeah, life is inconsistent, and contradictory, accepting that there is no meaning on this earth under the sun, that should drive us towards something that's greater than the sun, namely God, is what makes things beautiful. And if we can do that and understand that, then we can pray, God, give me the eyes to be able to see the beauty of the things in life in the midst of so much senselessness, in the midst of so much violence that we see on TV, in the midst of all these seemingly senseless and meaningless things in this world, that my heart desires you, that my soul longs after you, because you're the one that placed that desire within my heart. Because God truly does, according to Solomon, and he was confident of this, God makes things beautiful in its time. Life is beautiful when we see it from God's perspective. Life is beautiful when we stop trying to find meaning in and of ourselves and accept the fact that we can't, and we look elsewhere to find it. Let's pray. Father, we just thank you. Well, I'm not praying yet. What am I talking about now? You're going to pray. Sorry. Well, let's respond to what we kind of looked at today, and God is trying to teach us. And, in the busyness of our lives, it's so easy to find meaning in the things that we do. Our work is what gives us meaning. Our work is what drives us. Or our relationships, or our girlfriends and our boyfriends, all that stuff. All the things that God means for us to enjoy, but ultimately finding meaning within Him first so that we can enjoy those things properly. As young people, many times that's what drives us. That's what the things that we find meaning in. But, the great philosopher Ferris Bueller once said, life goes by pretty fast. And if you don't stop to look at it once in a while, you'll miss it. And I think there's a lot of truth in that we need to stop every once in a while and see that meaning cannot be found within our work. Meaning cannot be found in the midst of what we do. But rather, the acceptance of the fact that we can't find meaning is an indication that we need to find meaning somewhere else, and we can't do it on ourselves. And we can just acknowledge that before God. I want you to be able to do that with me, and as I do this with you, because I haven't figured it out all yet either, that I want to be able to say that life is beautiful in the midst of senselessness, in the midst of contradictions and inconsistencies, that I find life beautiful because God makes things beautiful in its time. Let's pray.